The Yield by Tara June Winch is set in Australia, in what is now called New South Wales. The name of the state, of course, gives us some insight into its colonial history. And The Yield is a novel about the Aboriginal people who lived on that land for hundreds, indeed thousands of years before settlers decided to rename it after a region of Britain. It's a novel that moves back and forth between the present and the past, and in doing so, it explores the relationship between the Wiradjuri people, the land that they still live on, albeit under threat of eviction, and the language in which these experiences can be expressed. Welcome to the World Literature Podcast. My name's Ivan Stacey, and on this channel we discuss literature from around the world, delving into the places, people and ideas brought to life in fiction, drama and poetry. In each episode, I invite an expert to give their views on a particular text or author. And today, I'm joined by Professor Frank Schulze-Engler from Goethe University, Frankfurt. I hope our conversation inspires you to read The Yield, and if you have anything to say about the novel or our conversation, please leave us a comment. And if you enjoy the content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Frank Schulze-Engler is recently retired. I'm sure it's well deserved because he's had a long and very distinguished career, mainly at Goethe University, Frankfurt. He's a huge figure, a huge scholar in world literature and transcultural literature. And his publications are really too numerous to list here, so I'll mention a few recent and important ones. This year, that's 2024, he published, co-edited with Pavan Kumar Malreddy, Mapping World Anglophone Studies, English in a World of Strangers. In 2023, he co-edited with Andrea Gremmels, Maren Schura and Urula Wegner, Entanglements, Envisioning World Literature from the Global South. And I'll mention one more because this has been an important text in my own journey into world literature and transcultural literature. From 2008, he co-edited Transcultural English Studies, Theories, Fictions, Realities with Sissy Health. There are many, many more I could name. It's a pleasure and an honour to be joined by Frank on the World Literature Podcast. Frank, great to have you with me. Thank you so much for coming on the World Literature Podcast.
Thank you for inviting me and having me here today.
My pleasure. So we're talking about The Yield. Could you start just by saying a little bit about the story, why you think people might be interested in reading it?
Yes. It is not one story, but three that in the end turn out to be all entangled with each other. And if we start with the story that is set in the present, it is a story about a young Aboriginal woman returning home after the death of her grandfather. She more or less fled from Australia and her family because she couldn't bear the situation. It was too stifling for her. Part of this, as she realizes later, is also because she couldn't really handle this marginalization that Aboriginal people in her hometown also had to face. It's not a single story, but this is one aspect that she later comes to appreciate and live with and overcome. Anyway, the purpose is she comes home because her grandfather has died and he needs to be buried, and her plan is she flies in from London, buries him, goes out again. That's the idea. And then things happen and the novel develops. And in the present strand, what happens is that a tin mine wants to take over the property, or has taken over the property on which this family has lived for generations. They want to surface mine that is totally destroy the whole landscape, and a struggle develops about stopping this. And in the end, without giving too much away, there are certain discoveries that are made, and they actually in the end lead to the tin mine being defeated, right? And the Aboriginal people actually successfully being able to claim their rights to this piece of land. This is the contemporary major strand, we could say. The second strand is the dictionary of Albert Goriwindi, who is the man who dies at the beginning. So there's a very, very brief prologue where he explains in 3 pages, why he is writing this dictionary. And after that, we only get pages from his dictionary. And the dictionary is an English Wiradjuri one, that is the language that Aboriginal people in that area are speaking. And these chapters are sort of interspersed, right? They come just, cut from the present to the dictionary and back. And it's not just 2, it's 3 strands. And the third one is a Reverend Greenleaf's story, the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, who came to exactly that area to do good for the Aboriginal people, as he thought, and who then witnesses some of the worst crimes, one has to say, committed against the Aboriginal population in the name of civilizing them. But actually, much of this doesn't even bother to, sort of give great justifications. It's just abuse, it's exploitation. And he witnesses this, he testifies to it, but all in the name of Christianity that in many ways is complicit with all of this. And in the end, he realizes, at least to some extent, that yes, he has been complicit. And of course, in the logics of, if you don't stand up soon enough, they will get you. He, because he's a German during World War I, gets deported as an enemy alien, right? So he actually comes to face not a fate, a fate similar, one could say, to Aboriginal people, not in material way, but at least he's ostracized, he's taken out of the community, he's not accepted as Australian, he's looked down upon, despised. And that is the end of his story. But there is an important link in his letters that we get also as blocks, simply not introduced, just coming one, interspersed into the story. And they also have something to do with the plot development in the present, right? But that's something maybe we can unravel a bit later. So this is this amazing structure, 3 stories. At first, one doesn't really know how they hang together, but as the novel progresses, we learn more and more until in the end, everything comes together in a quite, many ways, also surprising ending. Yeah.
Great, thank you. That's a great summary of a complex novel and a complex structure, while avoiding spoiling it for people as well. Let's talk first about the dictionary. As you just mentioned, it's written by the grandfather Albert. It's really central to the story. And what I noticed when reading this, a couple of times he refers to reading another dictionary, an English dictionary, in ways we might not expect. So at one point he says he reads this dictionary like the Bible front to back. He also said there are stories in there that'll knock your socks off. So, we don't normally associate dictionaries with stories. So why do you think the novel's making this kind of connection? What's going on with this particular aspect, would you say?
Yeah, that's a very puzzling. I mean, it's almost like, in the old days, reading a telephone directory. I mean, what do you get out of this? Just,
Our
endless lists
younger
of
viewers
words.
might need explaining what that
Yeah.
is. Yeah.
But the interesting thing is, I think part of the answer lies in what his own dictionary is like, because his own dictionary actually is stories.
Mm.
So he takes, and interestingly enough, he takes English words, and then he gives the translation in the Wiradjuri language, and then he explains. And some of these explanations run for several pages. So they are almost like, yes, stories within a dictionary. And I think what one can see in his characters is a great openness of mind, a curiosity. He doesn't learn English as an enemy language or because, no. For him, it's really mind-boggling to open his mind and to see perhaps all the stories behind these words, right? Which is then how he does his own dictionary. So I think this is very much all about, words, languages being in contact. This is exactly what his own dictionary is about. It is a dictionary meant to bring back the original Aboriginal language. But interestingly enough, it is brought back in the medium of English.
Mm.
So both because it's an Anglophone novel, but also because his dictionary is mainly Anglophone, right? So it is saturated with Wiradjuri words on the one hand, and cultural knowledge and history, including his own life history, but also things that go beyond to, his ancestors, to Aboriginal knowledge that he has received from people who came before him. So, and in that sense, it is a piece of storytelling, right? Um, although it is called a dictionary, and it is, of course, in some ways, right? Although it's very interestingly, it starts actually from Z,
Mm.
which isn't there in the Aboriginal language, so he starts with Y, right? And he has the English words first, and then the Wiradjuri words, right? And then he explains them in English with a lot of Wiradjuri put in. And in the afterword to the yield, the author explains, right, how much he's actually concerned about language politics, about the need to recuperate and reclaim Aboriginal languages, particularly, right, the one from her own area, Wiradjuri. And she refers to language recuperation efforts in real life, right, which in a
Mm.
sense have shaped and motivated her also to write that book. But I think the most important thing to stress here is that all of this is already in movement, in translation, in change, right? So there is no pristine Aboriginality to return to.
Mm.
The living generations now have to recuperate what they can, but in a world where English has also become their mother tongue. It is not the same as the Aboriginal language to which they have another attachment, but the world they live in is one where, of course, they all speak English and where English is the main medium of communication for them. And I think one must not see this as a contradiction. It is, or if it is a contradiction, it is the contradiction of Aboriginal life in contemporary Australia. But I think trying to get too much into this idea of a pristine original cultural language and so on, that means misunderstanding, I think, the productive moves this book makes, and also
Mm.
maybe a lot of the language politics that goes on, which is not one of nostalgic returning to some moment, but actually using the past to shape the present and the future.
I think, I mean, it strikes me as you're talking another aspect of the dictionary in terms of, there's the relationship between English and Wiradjuri uh, within the book, but the way it sort of, he begins by sort of asking you, the reader, to feel a word in their mouth. So we're kind of invited into that
Yeah,
process, which is an invitation, but it's also difficult. You're reading
right.
this word and it's unfamiliar, of course, right?
Yes. And it ends that way too. This is the bracket. It actually starts with, let me, as you say, it's a bit unfamiliar. It's very unfamiliar to me
Mm.
too. Ngurambang. Let's imagine it's somehow pronounced something like that.
I'm glad you
And
tried it rather than me. Yeah.
yes, I was born on Ngurambang. This is how the book begins. This little prologue, right, in which Albert Gondowindi actually explains this project. And it ends actually with a dictionary entry, right, that is on Australia, Ngurambang. And very clearly, Ngurambang from is his part of the country. But somehow he also claims Australia as a whole, not as an imperialist who wants to enlarge, right? But somehow the two things for him flow into each other. So it's not an exclusivist thing at all. It is
Mm.
actually his way also of being Australian and relating to Australia. And the last one, Australia, Ngurambang. Can you hear it now? Say it, Ngurambang.
Mm.
That's the end of it all, yeah. So, and that's another example, I think, how strong, yes, these words impact. And the idea is not all of this may be 100% understandable, certainly not at first glance. But I think the book does not play with this idea of untranslatability, saying, there is a cultural richness outsiders will never understand. That may be true with individual words, I mean, we know that from any language, there are certain words that express one thing, one concept, one feeling, whatever it is, in such a way that in any other language you will need more words than one. So in that sense, it's untranslatable in the sense of one word. But if you take the effort, if you go into the effort of translating, you can actually translate. There may be contact and negotiation zones where things, are a bit difficult, but basically it can be done. And the book is exactly about this. It can be done and it must be done. Right?
And so we have this dictionary, which, as you've just, quite forcefully argued, is about the possibility of translation, even if it's difficult. There's also a sense of, reclaiming language and sort of stating the importance of, one's own language. But I mean, what was interesting to me also is there are key junctures in the novel where things are left unsaid,
Yes.
and the things that are left unsaid actually play a key part in how the story develops. So, what did you make of those? Is there a suggestion that language has its limits, perhaps? Is it, more about the pressures that are placed on language that maybe render people silent? Are there other aspects of communication, aspects other than language itself? Of course, we communicate in many ways. I'm waving my hands around here. That are also kind of indispensable.
Right. Yeah, that's a really important and interesting aspect. Because and now, of course, I mean, we're in the middle now, so we can start to spoil. There is the story of Jeddah, the missing sister. All right. August is the young woman who comes back, the granddaughter, and she had a sister who disappeared. And this disappearance of Aboriginal people, even indigenous people, one could say in general, is something that I think is very symptomatic of indigenous cultures worldwide. There is the story, for example, which many people will know in Canada, of the residential schools, right, where so many children disappeared, either in the sense of being taken from their family to the school in order to estrange them from their families. And as we've seen over the last few years with all these graves being dug up, yes, children also disappeared under the ground because they died in these institutions. And of course, in Australia, with these policies of the stolen generations, right? Again, mixed children mainly being taken away from their families in order to, again, estrange them from Aboriginality and make them serviceable to the majority society as servants and whatever. And in the end, breed out. There was a genetic, eugenic spirit in this as well, breed out the Aboriginal, right? So this was the sort of background. So again, people disappeared, either some of them died, but they disappeared in terms of the community. So this is at the background. But of course, this is not a blaming novel. It is a cruel novel because, of course, in some sense, it draws back on this cruel history. The place where all of this takes place is called Massacre Plains. If you look on the map, it's there in Australia. And it's called that because of the history, because Aboriginal people were massacred there. So this is there. But at the same time, the story of the missing sister is cleared up in Albert Conte Windy's dictionary, because he actually has an entry where he explains that an uncle who abused both girls, or tried to abuse both girls, but only abused Jeddah because she stood in for her daughter, for her sister, sorry. After Jeddah disappeared, he confronted him. He threw a spear at him and wounded, and then he ran away, but he managed to escape. And it was very clear that he actually was the one who murdered Jeddah. So the story of violence is one that is historically embedded in colonial violence against Aboriginal people, undoubtedly so. But that does not make Aboriginal people saints. It does not make them infallible. It does not make them good. They are people like anybody else, including there are people who shamelessly exploit others, like this uncle. So it is a story of violence from which people have to disentangle themselves. And it is a complex story. But of course, the background to all of this is this massive colonial violence and the marginalization of Aboriginal people in Australia. Yeah. Sorry, if I can add one thing, because now it was the question of the limits of language, right? And so I think, to me at least, I would read the novel not so much about being the limits of language, but the limits of communication. It's not that these things cannot be said, but they will not be said. There is a feeling of shame, for example, that is central. Albert mentions it strongly. He has an entry on shame in his dictionary. And he says, I will not live with this anymore. I will not be ashamed of being Aboriginal, right? And the same, August goes through the same experience, right? Of having to overcome her shame and turn it into something more productive. And this shame includes keeping Jeddah as a ghost in the family, right? But not really talking about it, not, yeah. So this is a good example of where there are limits of communication, but it is not that language would not carry this communication. I think it is more that people choose not to communicate for a number of reasons. And many of them tied, of course, to this unfortunate history, right, of how Australia treated Aboriginal people, the majority society.
Thank you. And we are talking about violence against people, and that's, both this sort of the widespread and systemic violence of colonialism and its legacy, but also the sort of individual incidents within the book. There's also violence against the natural world. Maybe I shouldn't sort of so tritely equate those two things, but there's, you mentioned the tin mine, and the threat to the land on which the family are living is central. And there are several sections, both within the story and within Albert's dictionary, that deal with the environment and the natural world. Various references to practices for cultivating the land. How do you think the novel's thinking about issues of language, which we've talked about, issues of reading and writing, how do these connect to the way that it explores the relationship between humans and nature?
Right. I think that link is extremely important in the novel. I mean, the tin mine story, in a sense, is only perhaps the most spectacular moment which comes in the present of the story, right? It is like the ultimate destruction that comes now through this extractivism, which is literally one, like this surface mining does. It simply denudes whole landscapes, and later on make some efforts to plant some trees somewhere else or whatever. But it is total destruction. And so this is one side, and this is what the struggle is, to actually maintain their livelihood and maintain, the river that is so important to them. The Gondiwinis have always lived by the river, right? It is to protect the landscape and in a sense, their own livelihood, their own being. So that is one side of it. But as you already said, Albert's dictionary is full of agricultural terms. And that's very interesting because it shows that Aboriginal people have actually been doing agriculture for thousands of years. And this is, of course, one of the most surprising moments in the novel at the end, when it transpires. And this is also one way where, shall we say, material life and language and books come together. It transpires that there are remnants, archaeological findings, which somehow got forgotten. And they actually testify to the fact that this area in question here has actually been settled by Aboriginal people for thousands of years, and not this imagination of, Aboriginal people sort of always on the move, hunting kangaroos or whatever. And no. Actually, they have lived there. They even planted, and this is what is so interesting, the yield, of course, so many associations in the title, but one of them has to do with wheat. Wheat farming, of course, was introduced or so many people believed, to Australia by the white settlers.
Mm.
But it transpires actually through the archaeological findings and also through Albert's dictionary and his explanations that Aboriginal people in that area have been planting wheat for a long, long time. So they were actually farmers, right? And they had a culture based on farming. So that makes the whole thing very interesting because one can assume that, of course, this farming was much more sustainable, perhaps, than what we see in the present. And there are hints about farming practices, right? The fact that today's agriculture often, obviously, in order to gain higher yields,
Mm.
actually, of course, exploits the soil and has to add more and more fertilizers, and it uses up a lot of water. There's a big water problem in the area, which also is related to agriculture and agricultural practices. So, of course, there's a critique here also of a sort of extensive or intensive agriculture that is not sustainable.
Mm.
That is, in a sense, a flip side to the tin mine story, right? So the
Yeah.
two go together. Yeah, yeah. But it's interesting, if I can just add that one sentence, that the Aboriginal people are not ideal nature protectors.
Mm.
There is a nature protector movement as well that fights against the tin mine, people outside, mainly white people, right? And when they meet for the first time, uh, in the end, they come together, yes, but it's not so easy
Mm.
because the environmentalists say we are protecting the water. And the Aboriginal characters, well, we are protecting our home. So
Mm. Yeah.
the two things are related, yes, but they're not identical. Yeah.
Mm.
And it is not that the Aboriginal people know everything about ecology. Some of the things these water people explain them, they didn't know.
Mm.
They find it very interesting because obviously it adds their own knowledge of their own country, right? Like water filtration system and things to do with the water levels and all of that, right? So it's not that they have all the novel knowledge they need somehow mysteriously inside them already,
Mm.
but there is a strong indication here that Aboriginal farming practices, for example, were much more sustainable. And maybe something to think back to at a moment where contemporary agriculture in Australia is indeed reaching certain limits, and
Mm.
parts of agriculture are no longer sustainable and have to be given up.
Mm. Great, thank you. Well, I think that would be a good time to take a break. So we will come back for part two. We will, I think, broaden out the discussion into some wider concerns, thinking about, nature of literature, world literature in terms like this.
Um,
So we'll take a break now. Please do join us for part two. Hope to see you all there.